Actual manuscripts of Wycliffe's students were used as kindling to start the fire. His last words were that in 100 years, a man would be raised up whose calls for reforms and changes could not be suppressed. It was a prophetic utterance because 100 years later, on All Saints' Day, Halloween Eve, October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther would nail 95 theses of contention to the Wittenberg door calling for reforms.
Within a stone's throw of this very spot, John Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1455. It was a 10-year effort, and with the help of John Faust, a very wealthy resident of Mainz, and a manservant by the name of Peter Schaeffer, movable type, and the first printed book came off the presses. That book was the Gutenberg Bible, the Bible in Latin, simply the most beautiful book that has ever been printed. That book today, in the 100 greatest books, the list of those books still ranks number one. It ranks above even the King James Bible in its beauty and its typography. In the late 15th century, the early part of the 1490s, a professor named Linacre at Oxford went down to Italy to study the Greek language in one of these Greek refugee camps. And he read the Gospels in Greek. And as he read them, an incredible feeling of frustration came over him. And that night in his diary, Linacre wrote, "Either this is not the gospel or we are not Christians." The Latin text was corrupt. It was totally corrupt from the meaning that God wanted communicated. Simultaneously with Linacre's experience in Italy, John Colet had visited a church, a great church in Florence that was pastored by a man named Savonarola. And the reason that John Colet was so overwhelmed by the ministry of Savonarola is that he would try to get to the church on a Sunday morning, and there would be more people outside trying to get in than the church could contain, which was already full to the rafters. John Colet learned what Savonarola was saying. He was allowing the Apostle Paul to speak in the language of the people from these Greek texts. And the response was revival. Well, John Colet went back, started holding chapel services on the university campus. All he did was read the epistles of Paul in the Greek and translate that reading into English to the students that were sitting in the pew. And within a month, the chapel couldn't hold all the young people that wanted to hear this. And John Colet began to do the same thing at London, at St. Paul's Cathedral, that he had done at the chapel up at Oxford. And the results were overwhelming. Within 6 months, there were 15 to 20,000 people trying to get in St. Paul's Cathedral. Erasmus determined that he had to master this language and he had to fuel these changes. Today, we know the name Erasmus of Rotterdam because he simply was one of the most brilliant people that ever lived. It's kind of interesting. He was probably the last man on earth to know everything, at least everything from a book learning standpoint, because he had read and translated in his lifetime every single piece of literature that was accessible. Erasmus naturally said, well, we need to translate this Bible and print it in Greek and in English and in other languages. He made that announcement to a couple of scholar friends, and they were his friends, and they said, well, you'll not do it here, and you'll not do it anywhere in England, in fact. Erasmus was frustrated. He said, okay, if I can't do it here, I'll go to the continent and do it. Erasmus, with manuscripts borrowed from Thomas More and from John Colet and from friends at the University of Paris, took enough Greek manuscripts to basically make up a complete New Testament, and went to Basel in Switzerland, and there in 1514 and 1515 sat down and began to assemble a Greek text for the printing press. Erasmus died in this house in 1536. The house today is an antiquarian bookshop, and it's the place where John Froben had his presses, and in a period of 20 years, from 1516 until 1536, produced over 25,000, perhaps as many as 35,000 of Erasmus's greatest contribution to scholarship and to the study of the Bible, which was his Greek Latin text, first printed in 1516. The Archbishop of Mainz, with a copy of Erasmus's Greek Latin text in his hands, made the declaration that, first of all, in truth, he did not know what this book was, but he was convinced that what it contained condemned him.
The following exhortation in the preface of the Erasmus New Testament demonstrates his courage. I utterly dissent from those who are unwilling that the sacred scriptures should be read by the unlearned, translated into their own vulgar tongue. I wish that even the weakest woman should read the Gospels and the epistles of St. Paul. I long that the farmer should sing some portion of them to himself as he follows the plow. Erasmus's translation became a primary source for Martin Luther's German translation 6 years later, and William Tyndale's English translation 3 years after that. The first English convert to the Reformation was burned at the stake in 1531. His name was Thomas Bilney, a pioneer of the English Reformation. In 1517, Bilney was training for the priesthood at Cambridge University. He left his dormitory room one evening and made his way to a bookshop where forbidden books were sold. He purchased a copy of Erasmus's Greek-Latin New Testament. Hiding that night under a cover with his illegal purchase and flickering candle, he felt the strong light of God pour into his soul. He read in Timothy 1:15, where Paul stated that he was the chiefest of sinners, and that Jesus Christ came into the world to seek and save those who were lost. Bilney cried out, "No, I'm the chiefest of sinners." He became so enthusiastic about faith and about acting on the promises of God that hundreds of young men were converted to Christianity on the Cambridge campus. One night he confessed his sins to Professor Hugh Latimer. During his confession, he proclaimed the gospel of Jesus Christ. In his diary, Latimer wrote that he learned more about God and more about salvation from Bilney's confession than his previous 10 years at Cambridge University. In 1519, Bilney was ordained a priest and received his license to preach. He became a powerful force in distributing Tyndale's New English Bible and other forbidden literature throughout England. He eventually was arrested, tried, and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Through his faith, Thomas Bilney believed that God would not allow him to feel the heat of the flames. He comforted his friends the night before his burning and told them that he would not feel the heat of the flames. He said, "Though the fires should be of great heat to my body, yet the comfort of God's Spirit should cool it to my everlasting refreshing." The next morning, William Tyndale's Bibles were used as kindling to start the fire. Imagine an English-speaking world without Shakespeare, Tennyson, T.S. Eliot, and C.S. Lewis. They all had one common influence, a man whose prose and creativity in designing the English language is one of the greatest contributions to Western civilization in the annals of modern history. The father of the English language and the sole translator of the Bible into modern English must certainly be revered by every Christian and every English-speaking man or woman wherever English is taught. Surely such a man would have died in honor and wealth and was respected by all. In fact, His life and work are scarcely known to the intellectual community, much less to the common masses. And he died in poverty and in exile from his native country of England.